Christoph Cox is an associate professor of philosophy at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. He received his BA from Brown University and his PhD from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Professor Cox teaches and writes on 19th and 20th century European philosophy, intellectual history, and aesthetics. The University of California Press published his first book in 1999 entitled Nietzsche, Naturalism and Interpretation. What we have for you in the museum store is this one volume of his new book, but the rest came in FedEx and went over to Central Receiving and didn't get here in time for the opening tonight, but they will be here beginning Monday. And the title of that book, which I know you're all going to want, is called Audio Culture, Readings in Modern Music. It's edited by Christoph Cox and Daniel Warner. Audio Culture, Readings in Modern Music maps the oral and discursive terrain of vanguard music today. Rather than offering a history of contemporary music, Audio Culture traces the genealogy of current musical practices and theoretical concerns, drawing lines of connection between recent musical production and earlier moments of sonic experimentation. It aims to foreground the various rewirings of musical composition and performance that have taken place in the past few decades, and to provide a critical and theoretical language for this new audio culture. So I hope you'll have a chance to look at that book, but better yet, you have a chance to hear directly from Christoph Cox. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Christoph Cox. Professor Cox.
Thanks, Margaret. It's odd to hear myself called Professor Cox. I teach at a kind of hippie college where nobody even uses your last name, so let alone calling you professor. But welcome to this panel, which I think features a range of really important voices, curators, and artists. And I hope we'll have a good chance for discussion afterwards, and we'll be able to have a real conversation, not only amongst ourselves, but also with you. I want to start things off by giving a bit of context. So what I aim to do in just a short amount of time is to say a few words about the recent emergence of sound art, to say something about what I take this contested category, the sound art category, to be, and to offer a few initial reflections on some of the work, the three pieces that are presented in the AudioFiles exhibition, with which this forum is obviously connected. So Margaret and I were talking, a number of us were talking earlier today about the emergence of sound art as a category. There have been an increasing number of exhibitions, large-scale exhibitions, and some smaller-scale ones too, over the past decade, but primarily over the past 5 or 6 years. And the term sound art has become an increasingly prominent term in contemporary art. And the question arises, why this stuff now? Why this sudden interest in sound art? I can't say that I have any kind of definitive answer to that, but let me just offer a few suggestions. It's worth noting that, before I offer those suggestions, it's worth noting that by even 2000, before a number of these exhibitions happened, one of the founders, really the person who coined the term sound installation and who did some of the most pioneering work in sound installation, Max Neuhaus, declared sound art to be an art fad, and declared it to be over, and that the term asked that the term no longer be used anymore, or as he put it in this piece he wrote for an exhibition at PS1 in New York, sound art, the term has been consumed and we should forget about it. Now, Neuhaus is of course a venerable figure, surely one of the most important sound artists, sound installation artists alive. But I want, respectfully, to disagree with him and to offer a different sort of diagnosis and prescription for this term and for the category of art that it encompasses. I don't think that the recent interest in sound is simply a passing fancy of the art world. Rather, I think it connects with a broader and deeper set of changes in culture more generally. That is a turn toward the auditory, and the emergence of what I call audio culture and what's auditory culture, a whole range of terms for this. Now, media theorists have forecast this sort of turn since the 1960s. Chief among them, Marshall McLuhan and his protege Walter Ong have remarked that electronic media, such as the telephone, the phonograph, the radio, indicate a shift away from the culture of the eye that characterized early modern culture and modernity in general, toward a culture of the ear and a renewed experience of what McLuhan called acoustic space. In fact, McLuhan suggests that just as optics and the science of sight, the development of the telescope, et cetera, in the 17th and 18th centuries were integral to the European Enlightenment and its aftermath, so too the science of acoustics and its development, then the development of auditory technologies in the late 19th, early 20th centuries are integral to these cultural shifts, to the shifts toward what one might call a sort of audio culture or auditory culture. More recently, other theorists such as Jacques Attali and Chris Cutler have offered more nuanced versions of this thesis. And more recently still, cultural theorist Thomas Doherty remarked that with the advent of postmodernism, that is something that follows this Enlightenment obsession with vision, orality, that is orality with an AU, replaces specularity as the dominant and determining mode of perception. Now, these claims might strike the skeptic as merely speculative or perhaps merely wishful. But I think if we survey the contemporary scene, we see some empirical evidence and some interesting evidence for a kind of turn toward the auditory. One of the interesting features, I think, is a recent boom in auditory history and anthropology, a whole spate of books, and there have been really quite a number of them that have appeared over the past 10 years, in which social scientists primarily, but others as well, cultural historians and cultural theorists as well, have turned toward the auditory, turned toward sound to investigate historical and cultural difference. Books such as Richard Cullen Rath's How Early America Sounded, or John Picker's Victorian Soundscapes, Jonathan Stern's The Audible Past, Emily Thompson's The Soundscape of Modernity. All of these folks, it seems, working somewhat independently, have developed a kind of obsession with thinking about culture and history in terms of sound. And again, this happens entirely away from the realm of sound art. Most of these folks, a number of whom I've talked to, really have not much of a clue at all about sound art. But I think it's part of, again, we can think of it as part of a sort of cultural turn toward the oral. There's also been a widespread consideration, both in academic and popular culture, of the auditory arts of the 20th century. Auditory arts even other than those that constitute the musical domain. So, for example, Luigi Russolo and Pierre Schaeffer, two very important early 20th century, early to mid 20th century musical and sound theorists and producers, have never had such a sort of high reputation as they have today. I think this is connected with a renewed interest in non-musical sound and in sound as such, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I just want to just reiterate that I think sound art, this emergence of sound art within the past 10 years, is somehow connected to this to this new auditory culture and this emergence of the oral as a kind of sort of shift in the sensorium, a kind of new sensory domain. So let me go back to a bit of what I take sound art to be, a few sort of philosophical comments. Against Newhouse, I want polemically to affirm this term sound art and the various practices that fall under its name. It's important, I think, to embrace the notion that the sonic and the auditory can themselves be the stuff of art. At least since the Renaissance, hearing has always been, or has been for the past, whatever, 500-600 years, the second sense, right? Second, of course, to vision. Until recently, where sound found its way into art, it did so primarily as a kind of prop or attendant to the visual. Take the film soundtrack, for example, which rarely stands on its own, or, for example, MTV, which insists that somehow or other songs ought to be visualized. Of course, MTV doesn't actually show videos anymore, does it? But they do in Europe. To another instance, take the current curatorial and artistic fascination with synesthesia, right? Synesthesia is the neurological phenomenon in which sensory stimulation of one sensory modality triggers experience in another. For example, colored hearing, or to quote the title of a recent book on synesthesia, The Man Who Tasted Shapes, right? Tasting shapes. In the past year alone, there have been 5 fairly major exhibitions of synesthetic art, including 2 blockbusters, Visual Music, which is currently, I think, still up. It's about to go down. It's still up at the Hirshhorn in Washington, D.C. Son et Lumière at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, that earlier this year. What Sound Does a Color Make, which just went down at I-Beam in New York. All of these, this interest in combining the auditory and the visual. But of course, in all of these exhibitions, it turns out that, that these works take the form of a kind of visualization of sound, sort of responding to the imperative that we be given something to look at, which, oddly enough, I'm indulging in here too, talking to you while presuming that you need something to look at up there. What can I do? This is, in this context, I think, sound art challenges the hegemony of the visual and restores to sound its ontological and aesthetic status. But you might ask, as do folks like Newhouse, why not just call this stuff music? After all, there has been an auditory art for probably as long as human beings have been around, and it's called music, and it has to do with, appreciating the nature of sound. But I think that there are good reasons for distinguishing between music and sound art, and I don't want to draw any sort of hard, fast line here and to sort of separate these two absolutely, but I want to indicate them as kind of different sorts of poles and give you some suggestions for why it is that I think there's an important distinction to be drawn here. First of all, music and speech constitute a kind of restricted domain of sound. They constitute what Friedrich Kittler, and I'm not going to go elaborately into this philosophical scheme, but I just want to point it out, what Friedrich Kittler, the great sort of theorist of 19th and 20th century media, who, following the psychoanalytic theorist Jacques Lacan, calls the order of the symbolic. That is, speech and music have to do with articulated sound that's embroiled in social codes and conceptions of social order. Okay, sound art deals with a much wider domain, with the domain of what John Cage called the entire field of sound, made possible by recording technologies. Cage was fascinated by the fact that the tape recorder, for example, or the phonograph, records all of sound, right? Records anything that can be, right? Records sound itself. Doesn't distinguish at all between noise, speech, music, etc. All of it becomes the stuff of recording, okay? As such, sound exist as the kind of sonic substrate of music and language, what Kittler and Lacan call the real. Okay? That is, they concern, for example, not the voice we hear in poetry, but the grain of the voice that we hear in sound poetry. Or not the ordered intervals of music, but the noise, the silence, and the matter of sound that's so often the subject of sound art. Okay? Sound, then, is concerned with the entire domain of the auditory, the very condition of possibility for music and speech, for example. So I won't go into it now, but we could also mark differences between music and sound art with regard to their relationships to space and time. More elaborate than we probably have time for now, but if we want to talk about it in the discussion, we can. So in different ways, I think, that each of the pieces in the AudioFiles exhibition foregrounds this acoustic reel, this sort of stuff of sound. Each employs a set of ready-mades, speaker cones, fluxus objects, vacuum cleaners, harmonicas, and each works by exploiting and exploring the basic sonic properties of these objects. So for example, Stephen Vitiello's Wind in the Trees centers on that most elemental piece of sound reproduction technology, the vibrating diaphragm of the loudspeaker. Hung in a wave formation, the sculptural placement of these speakers already highlights the physics of sound. These speaker cones vibrate, driven by a subsonic composition of low frequencies. They're intensely animated, even though they don't make a sound. They draw attention, I think, to the fact that vibration is the essence not only of sonic and acoustic production, but also of their reception. It's always seemed to me, and Stevens exhibited various versions of this piece, recently one in Seattle, where I just was with it and him. These pieces, these fragile speaker cones which vibrate, I think serve not only as to remind us of the sonic production as vibration, but also that hearing itself and the vibrating diaphragm of the tympanum or the eardrum the reception of sound is constituted exactly by that sort of receptive vibration. And these things are like kind of external tympanum or tympani, or however, whatever the plural of that is. Christian Marclay's shake, rattle, and roll flux mix reanimates a crucial chapter in the history of sound art. The activities of Fluxus, whose sonic practices were crucial to the genesis of what we know today as sound art. Now, Marclay is probably best known through his work as a DJ and his visual work with vinyl records. He often notes that records, these vinyl slabs, are these dead objects, sort of dead archival things that, mute objects that the DJ brings to life again. Shake, rattle, and roll, I think, as Preston also mentioned, is a kind of extension of this project. So Fluxus artists such as George Mishunis, Joseph Beuys, Yoko Ono, and others employed a host of everyday objects, just usually everyday, very non-special things, as sound-producing devices for use in ephemeral happenings and performances. But these items have since become the stuff of art history and art collection, and as such, they've become these sort of dead objects, these sort of embalmed objects. Once a part of, a living, performative tradition, just everyday things, now the stuff of art archives, right? Marclay treats these objects as he does his records, right? He takes these dead things and he reanimates them again. Of course, his treatment is also somewhat ironic. Each of these, if you haven't seen this already, right? Each of these frames, figures, has Marclay's white gloves, which the Walker Art Center made him put on. I think this wasn't his choice, but it turns out to be an interesting one, right? These sort of these white gloves reveal and I think sort of subtly criticize the idea that these things are precious art objects. And of course, you're not supposed to take art objects and bang them around. And his own performance, of course, though, is no longer live, right? He did it once live, but now is itself takes place in the form of a recording, in this case, a video recording. Céleste Boursier-Mougenot's Harmonic Chaos also employs a set of ready-mades for both humorous and serious purposes. The use of a dozen or so vacuum cleaners to play harmonicas is certainly funny and sculpturally intriguing, constituting a kind of bizarre domestic chorus or a kind of, redux of a pipe organ, kind of weird modernist pipe organ. But the use of these vacuum cleaners, I think, also draws attention to the basic sound-producing properties of air and breath. They also connect with the dialectic between the dead and the living that Marclay's work sort of works with so often. Long before Marclay, Edison's phonograph was greeted as a sort of, greeted as a kind of, I guess, uncanny machinic object that, a machine that talks, which the early phonographs were called talking machines, and they were very sort of perplexing and disturbing insofar as the phonograph made it possible for the dead to speak again, right? We don't think twice when we turn on the radio. We hear, whatever, Elvis or Jimi Hendrix or whatever, these sort of dead people that still, play for us. It was sort of uncanny in that regard. Boursier-Mougenot's vacuum cleaners do something similar, it strikes me. They do what the human body can't do, that is, they can indefinitely sustain indrawn breaths. And moreover, I think they reveal the capacity of machines to improvise, or at least to generate novelty. And Celeste can correct me on this, but the tuners that monitor and trigger these vacuum cleaners become sort of overwhelmed by the material that they're sort of monitoring and taking in, and as a result produce a kind of unpredictable and shifting orchestration. So just to quickly conclude before we hear from Céleste about his own projects, AudioFiles, it seems to me, joins the growing number of exhibitions that foreground the materiality of sound, its inscription, its transmission, and its resonance. It calls upon us to attend not only to the visual, but also to the auditory, and not only to the symbolic domain of speech and music, but to the auditory real, the very stuff of sound and hearing, which we'll have a lot more to talk about in our discussion. Thanks a lot.